How Eamon Met Kaidan, Chapter 16, Somewhere Near Fort Eamon, Eastmarch. Loredas, the 25th of Evening Star, in the 201st year of the Fourth Era. Valmitjyr. Valmitjyr had left his uncle and father back in Darkwater Crossing. There was a healer in that town, and Volgan insisted that Eamon must be examined before they continued traveling. Valmitjyr also insisted on having a proper goodbye with the men. Partly to keep Eamon from losing his mind again, and partly because Mitty agreed with his uncle that Amelia could not be left unfound for even one more day. Mitt had only stayed in the little mining village long enough to refill his water skins and hire a fresh horse. His goal was to ride ahead along the Darkwater until it flowed into the White. It had been an easy journey up to this point, with good roads on flat ground, surrounded by forest glades and the occasional farmer's field. When he made it to the place where the two rivers joined, the landscape changed rather abruptly, and Mitty was faced with a decision. Would he go upstream into the foothills, or would he go downstream through the sulfur springs and salt flats to the east? The White River was the longest and widest of all the rivers in Skyrim, and it was the most violent, too. This section of the river was particularly fast, moving over a series of naturally terraced cliffs. The sound of the falls here was almost deafening. He decided he would go upstream. He didn't know much about the land of Eastmarch, but he knew that this place they were looking for was hidden and derelict, and you couldn't hide much of anything in the flat, treeless land east of him. No, he would go west. Fort Eamon sat on a hill right above him, and he rode up to the front gate to see if they were on the post route where he could turn in his horse and leave directions for Uncle Eamon and his father. As he approached the gatehouse, he saw that the men standing guard were young, about his age, and they were wearing the badge of Ulfric's Stormcloak instead of the Mead crest. He'd heard his father and the Greatfather discussing the hostilities gearing up in Eastmarch and the Reach, but talk was the only part of it that had come to Falkreath so far, and this was the first time Mitt had seen any evidence of the rebellion in person. He pulled his hood back to let the men see his face, and dismounted so that they could see he carried no weapon. There would be no advantage in agitating these men who were already primed and looking for a fight. "You men have a coaching stable here?" Mitty asked. One of the guards waved his arm back, indicating he should enter the bailey. "Yeah, go on back. It's off to the right. You can't miss it." "Thank you," Mitt said. "My father and uncle will be coming along behind me in a couple of hours. Big Nord with brown hair and a high elf. If you see them, would you tell them I was here and decided to follow the road upriver on foot until they catch me up?" The guard he'd spoken with nodded his agreement, but the man's partner said, "We don't have much to do with elves in Eastmarch, kinsman." Mitty was used to this, and he was also used to handling it. "Well, that's a shame," he said. "My uncle has been a son of Skyrim for 200 years. Your Jarl would be well served by a man like him." "They aren't men," the Stormcloak insisted. "No," Mitt said, "they are not. They live longer than men. They are bigger than men, and they have more powerful magic than men. So a smart man would try to learn from the elves who have made their home in this province, the ones who are on our side." With that, he turned to the first guard and said, "My thanks. You gentlemen have a good day." "You are a traitor to your kin," the other man said. Mitty considered ignoring this, as he had so many times before. He was here for Amelia, after all, and she was practically family at this point. Something in that man's tone, however, just plucked at the wrong nerve. He couldn't let it go this time. His shoulders sagged in frustration, and then he straightened and turned back to the ignorant Stormcloak. "My uncle is my kin, boy," Mitt said. "Do you know who the Thalmor hate more than Nords?" "They don't hate anything more than they hate us," the man said. "Oh, but that is not true. They don't actually hate us, you know? They think of us as ants, just sad, annoying, lower life forms to be exterminated or used or pitied. That isn't hate, brother. That's disregard. My uncle now, he's a different story. His father opposed the Thalmor at the end of the Third Era and brought his entire family to Skyrim. So my uncle grew up right here in the north, back when all of our great-grandfathers were just a sparkle in some ancestor's eye. He became a man under the Storm Crown, and he had blood kin who died fighting the Thalmor in the Night of Green Fire. He pulled people out of the rubble after the Great Collapse, and he helped the people who stayed there rebuild their farms. And then he fought against the Dominion in the Great War. He married a Nord woman, my auntie, and he's been apothecary in our hold for longer than either you or I have been alive. He's delivered more Nord babies and saved more Nord lives than men like you and I could ever even hope to, because his kind live long enough to leave a mark like that, and we men don't. The elves of Somerset don't think of my uncle the way they think of you and me, kinsman. To them, he is not just a bug to be squashed. No, we're the vermin, you understand. But my uncle and others like him are a threat. That's who they hate. That's who they're afraid of. Not you, not even Jarl Ulfric. They're afraid of Myr, like my uncle, who give their loyalty to men. So grow up, little milk drinker. My uncle is more Nord than you'll ever be. You think on that for a while, and remember when they come up here in a few hours looking for me, you tell them I went up the road west on foot. And if you know what's good for you, you'll be polite to my uncle when you do it. Less than an hour later, Valmitjyr was back on his way, and he hadn't gotten more than a quarter mile up the road when the tree cover made it too hard to see the opposite side of the river. Unlike the banks of the Darkwater, which had been mostly flat and made up of rich soil, the White River had no true bank. On both sides, there were nothing but towering piles of rocks and trees that stubbornly forced their roots into the cracks between boulders. Mitty would have to leave the road and do his best to hike up the rocky embankment if he wanted to be thorough. It occurred to him that this would actually be a good place to hide from the world. It was remote, hard to get to, and almost impossible to see from the road. The rocks here climbed high above the water, and he wasn't sure how he would get down to it from here even if he did manage to find what he was looking for. He could see the remains of a ruined wooden building below him that had once been some kind of hunter's shack or maybe a poor man's house. The river had eventually eaten away at the soil underneath the foundation, and half of the structure had collapsed. His eye scanned the opposite bank, and he almost missed it, but then the wind changed direction coming from behind him in a great gust, and when it reached the foliage on the other side of the river, the flowing movement of the trees drew his eye to the shape that didn't move along with them. It was the shape of a large, heavy-looking door, and as he studied the spot closely, he realized the door was built into the side of a very large structure. The building was covered with thick ivy, and there were trees growing out of parts of the ruined stonework. He'd been staring straight at it without seeing a thing. But now that he knew what to look for, his eyes found the outlines that showed him the truth. That was an ancient tower. "Sweet breath of kine," he said in wonder. And then he turned around to look over his shoulder in the direction of Kinnereth's mountain. I thank you. Most kindly," he said, and then another gust of wind just like the first one rushed over his face. He looked back at the crumbling ruin, and sure enough, it was still there. This must be the place. He began considering how he might get down there, or find a way across the water once he did, but before he'd formulated much of a plan to accomplish that task, the door was flung open as though it had been kicked, and 3 Altmer males came striding out of it, using body language that indicated an argument of some kind or upset. Valmitjyr's heart jumped into his throat at the sight of them, and he dropped down onto the rocks, stretching out onto his belly and making himself as flat and small as he could. They were far below him down there, but if any one of them looked up, they could see him. He began to crawl backward on his stomach, pushing himself away from the edge of the stone face hand over hand, until he was far enough back that he couldn't see the elves anymore. If he couldn't see them, they couldn't see him, he thought, and then he waited. The roaring of the falls blocked out almost all other sound, and now that he couldn't see them either, the anxiety threatened to become panic. "Okay, Lady Kaidan," he whispered. "Since you seem to be in a helpful mood today, I would very much appreciate any advice you might have." But this time there was no friendly gust of wind to show him the way forward. "Figures. You are right, my lady," he said to the god of wind. "I suppose 2 miracles in one day is a bit much to ask for." Mitt assessed his options. He couldn't lay here forever, and now that he knew he'd found the right place, he needed to clear his head and wait for these elves to either go back inside or move along. He decided there could be no harm in rolling over onto his back to wait. Being on his belly was dreadfully uncomfortable, so he pushed himself over, only to find himself nose to nose with a horse, which immediately blew a startled exhale from its large nose directly into Mitty's face. Though Valmitjyr would never admit it to a soul, he let out a squeal worthy of any frightened 6-year-old child. But instead of running or kicking or any of the other dangerous things a startled horse is wont to do, it simply lifted its head from the small tuft of grass it had been trying to coax out of a crack in the stones, and looked at Mitty with something like vexation. "Where in the name of the 8 did you come from?" he asked. The horse gave no reply, except to put her head back down and resume her efforts at pulling up a snack from the ground. "What is happening to my life right now?" the man sighed. The horse made a huffing sound. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Having nothing else to do from his current position, Mitt looked more closely at his equine visitor. "Wait, do I know you?" he whispered. The soft brown mare had no saddle, but still wore a bridle. "Oh my days," Mitt breathed. "My father made your bridle." No mistake, that was his father's mark on the leather strap beside the mare's ear. The horse lifted her nose again and huffed in his face for a second time. And then, as if the horse's breath had commanded it, the sky opened up with a heavy, drenching downpour that soaked him in seconds. Valmitjyr looked up to the clouds, threw his arms out in defeat, and said, "All right, Lady Kaidan, goddess of wind and breath and rain, yeah, I get it. You have my attention." Careful not to do anything sudden that would startle the mare this time, Mitt rolled over onto his stomach and crawled to the edge for another look. The door still hung wide open, but the elves were nowhere in sight. He had no idea if they had left or if they had simply ducked back inside to get out of the rain. It didn't matter, though. He could leave now, and that was all he needed. He backed away from the edge again and rose to his knees, looking over at the horse who, despite being so close, seemed perfectly content to ignore him. "Who do you belong to, little miss?" He decided to stand and then reached slowly for the mare's bridle, gripping it softly around the cheek strap. Without any reins or a saddle, and knowing nothing about this animal except that she was wearing his father's gear and seemed docile, Mitty would not attempt to ride her. "Come with me, pretty girl," he said, and she seemed perfectly pleased to obey. He began picking his way back in the direction he had come, thinking the best thing to do would be finding a place with cover where he and this gift of Kaidan could sit together near the road and watch for his father without being seen themselves. After finding a suitable stand of trees with enough grass underneath to keep the horse from wandering off, Mitty leaned against a solid-looking maple trunk and wiped the water from his face. He watched through the branches for any sign of movement on the road. Waiting always makes time pass slowly, but even Mitty had to say that it wasn't long before his patience was rewarded. The elves apparently had some path he hadn't been able to see from up on the rocks, because as soon as the rain stopped, 2 of the Altmer walked up to the road's edge and stopped as if waiting for something. One was wearing dark robes with markings that made him look very important, and he was scolding the other elf who was walking alongside him. They were several yards away, but Mitt moved slowly into a low crouch anyway. The horse seemed oblivious. It seemed like the elves were waiting for someone. He assumed it must be that third elf he'd seen with them from up on the ridge. They began to speak, but they were using their own language, and like everything else, it was hard to make out much of anything other than the crashing sounds of falling water. Mitt didn't understand a word of what they were saying. What he did understand was the important-looking elf was furious, and after that one's repeated use of it with a lot of pointing, Mitt figured out that Ferald was the less important elf's name. The Altmer stopped speaking when a small convoy of sorts rolled up from the distant bridge. Mitty crouched next to his gift horse, patting her neck and gripping her bridle, praying she wouldn't choose this moment to make noise or start moving enough to draw the elves' attention. There was an enclosed carriage for passengers in the front, a flatbed cart carrying stacks of something irregular, but the cart's load was covered by a large canvas and tied down with rope. In the very back of the line was a third passenger cart, but this one was open to the air. There were 4 elves wearing leather armor sitting inside of it, and they all looked drenched by the rain and miserable. An Altmer male wearing some kind of ornate livery stepped down from the back of the first carriage and opened the door. The 2 Altmer he'd been watching stepped into it. The entire group took off with speed after that, toward the west. "Amelia might be in there right now," he said to the horse, but she just made another little huffing sound and didn't lift her head from the business of eating. Valmitjyr decided it was too dangerous for him to try and enter the building alone, and he couldn't go in there anyway without risking that his gift horse would wander away if he just left her here. He had nothing to tie her up with, and now that he'd accomplished the task of actually finding the place where Amelia was being held, he knew that the wisest thing he could do would be to return to Fort Eamon and wait for his uncle and father. He led the horse back out into the road, memorized the location of that nearly hidden door into the tower, and said, "We're getting you out of there, Amelia. I am coming back for you. I swear it." Hey y'all, this is Meriwether again. Thank you for listening. That was chapter 16. If you're still listening with me, thank you so much. And if this is the first time you've ever seen this and you clicked on this by accident and managed to get to the end where you're hearing me talk now, my goodness, you should look up chapter 1 because you're in the middle of a very long story. I wrote this story a couple of years ago. It was much shorter back then for my favorite Discord of Kaidan fans for the game of Skyrim. And I have been creating a character, and the ladies on that Discord and some of the gents on that Discord suggested that it would be fun to see the story of how Eamon and Kaidan met, so I wrote one. And then one of my friends there recorded chapter 1 in her lovely voice for me and gave it to me as a gift, and that inspired me. That was private, so I wasn't going to share that with everybody. But then that kind of encouraged me to do the whole thing for funsies, and it has been really fun. I wanted to add this note at the end because the map that gave me the inspiration for doing this episode the way I did it was created by an artist who has now disappeared from Reddit. They posted it on Reddit, and then I can't find anything about them. No name, no link to any art website, nothing like that. So if you made this map, please let me know. If you know who did make it, please let me know so that I can give proper credit for it. It's really well done, and it was absolutely perfect for my purpose, and seeing that map on Reddit was what gave me the idea to do this chapter this way. All right, that's enough of me babbling. Thanks very much, and I'll be back with more chapters next week. Bye.